Colin threw his head back and laughed, loud enough for the whole office to hear. "You start your own firm," he mocked, tapping his coffee mug against the conference table like a judge with a gavel. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. People around us froze mid-conversation. Some winced. Others looked away, embarrassed for me. My cheeks burned hot, and my hand tightened around the folder I was holding until the edges crumpled. He leaned closer, his eyes gleaming with something that looked like pleasure. "You'd sink it in a week, Lauren. You can barely handle the workload you have now." My stomach twisted into a knot. The air felt thick, suffocating. What the hell just happened? This wasn't a casual comment or friendly teasing. This was deliberate humiliation, performed for an audience. I stood there, frozen, while my supervisor destroyed my confidence in front of 20 colleagues. Someone coughed uncomfortably. Another person suddenly found their phone fascinating. But Colin just grinned, satisfied with his performance, and walked away like he'd won something. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, forcing my face into neutrality, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. My name is Lauren Pierce, and until that moment, I had never been humiliated so publicly, so deliberately, by someone who was supposed to mentor me. I was 31 years old and had spent 3 years at Westfield Consulting, building client relationships, fixing problems, and working late nights while Colin took credit for everything I accomplished. I wasn't naive. I knew office politics existed. I knew some supervisors played favorites and hoarded recognition. But this felt different. This felt personal. Colin hadn't just dismissed my idea. He had made it a spectacle, a joke to share with everyone within earshot. As I walked back to my desk, trying to keep my expression neutral, I replayed his words over and over. "You'd sink it in a week." The worst part wasn't the insult itself. It was the way everyone had laughed along with him, afraid to be on the wrong side of someone with power. I sat down at my cubicle, my hands still shaking slightly, and stared at my computer screen without really seeing it. Something inside me shifted in that moment. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. Something more focused. I opened a blank document and typed 2 words, business plan. When I joined Westfield Consulting 3 years earlier, Colin had been different. Or maybe I had just been too inexperienced to see through him. "Stick with me, Lauren," he'd said during my first week, flashing that confident smile that made him popular with senior management. "You'll go far." He'd meant it, I think. Back then, I was fresh out of graduate school with a master's in business analytics and 0 industry connections. Colin had seemed like the perfect mentor, someone who understood the consulting world and wanted to help newcomers navigate it. He gave me challenging projects, introduced me to important clients, and praised my work during team meetings. For the first 6 months, I thought I'd found the ideal supervisor. I worked harder than I ever had, determined to prove his faith in me wasn't misplaced. I stayed late, volunteered for difficult assignments, and studied everything I could about client management. Then something changed. I started getting better results than him. My client satisfaction scores exceeded his. My presentations were clearer, more polished. And slowly, his mentorship turned into something else entirely. He started taking credit for my reports. It began subtly. He'd ask to review my work before submission, which seemed reasonable at first. "Just want to make sure everything's aligned with company standards," he'd say. Then he'd forward my analysis to clients with his name listed as the primary contact, my contribution buried in a footnote or omitted entirely. When I questioned it, he'd wave me off. "Just streamlining the process, Lauren. Clients prefer dealing with senior staff." But I saw what was happening. My detailed market research that took weeks to compile became Colin's strategic insights. My innovative solutions to client problems became Colin's recommendations. My late nights and weekend work became his promotion portfolio. The resentment started there, quiet and simmering. I told myself it was normal, that this was how consulting worked, that paying your dues meant letting supervisors claim your victories. But deep down, I knew it was theft. He was stealing my work, my ideas, my professional identity, and wrapping them in his own ambition. And the worst part? Everyone pretended not to notice. Or maybe they genuinely didn't see it. Either way, I was invisible while Colin shined brighter using my light. Colin began singing praises for Aaron, a new hire who spent more time scrolling social media than completing assignments. Sharp guy, Colin insisted during team meetings, nodding approvingly whenever Aaron spoke, even when his ideas made no sense. Real strategic thinker. Watch and learn from him, everyone. I watched, all right. I watched Aaron arrive late, leave early, and submit work so sloppy that I had to fix it before clients saw it. I watched him charm Colin with sports talk and weekend golf plans while I quietly carried the actual workload. Aaron didn't finish a single assignment on time. His client presentations were full of errors. His reports lacked depth and analysis. But he laughed at Colin's jokes, remembered his coffee order, and knew exactly how to make himself likable. That, apparently, was enough. When promotion discussions came around, Colin nominated Aaron. Not me, despite my 3 years of flawless performance. Aaron, who'd been with the company for 8 months and contributed almost nothing of value. The favoritism was so obvious it hurt. But nobody challenged it. Nobody questioned why competence mattered less than camaraderie. I learned a brutal lesson then. Hard work means nothing if the person judging you values loyalty over results. I worked for days on a pitch deck for a potential client worth over $2 million in annual revenue. I researched their industry, analyzed their competitors, and crafted a customized strategy that addressed their specific challenges. I practiced the presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep. The morning of the meeting, I arrived early, set up the conference room, and reviewed my notes one final time. Then Colin walked in. Actually, Lauren, I'll deliver this presentation, he said casually, picking up my laptop like it was his. You watch and learn. It's important you see how senior consultants handle high-stakes pitches. My mouth went dry. But I created this entire deck. I know every detail. Exactly. Which means you can answer questions if I need backup. He smiled that patronizing smile I'd grown to hate. Don't worry. This is good experience for you. Seeing how the professionals do it. I sat in the back of the room, silent and furious, while Colin presented my ideas as if he'd birthed them from his own genius. He stumbled over technical details I could have explained perfectly. He fumbled the competitive analysis I'd spent hours researching. But he had confidence, charm, and seniority. And we won the client. Afterward, senior management congratulated Colin on his brilliant strategy. My name was never mentioned. My fists were clenched so tight my nails left crescent moons in my palms. During my yearly review, Colin sat across from me with a bland expression and delivered his assessment. You're adequate, Lauren. Adequate. The word hung in the air like a slap. I stared at him, waiting for more, for context, for any acknowledgement of the reality we both knew. But he just nodded, satisfied with his judgment. You do your job. You meet expectations. Nothing particularly impressive, but nothing concerning either. I could barely breathe. Despite carrying half his workload while he golfed with clients. Despite saving 2 failing accounts that were hemorrhaging money when he'd mismanaged them. Despite mentoring every new hire because Colin was too busy networking to actually train anyone. Despite working nights and weekends while he posted vacation photos from beach resorts. Adequate. That word stung worse than any insult. It was dismissive, reductive, designed to keep me in my place. When I tried to mention my specific contributions, he cut me off. I'm sure you work hard, Lauren. But results speak louder than effort. And the results are, well, adequate. He had stolen my results, rebranded them as his achievements, and now used their absence in my official record to justify keeping me down. It was brilliant manipulation, really. And I had no way to fight it without sounding like I was making excuses. So when I casually mentioned during a team lunch that I'd been thinking about eventually starting my own consulting firm, I hadn't expected much reaction. It was more daydream than actual plan. Something I'd been mulling over privately. But Colin's response shattered any remaining illusions I had about his intentions. He didn't just dismiss my idea. He weaponized it. You start your own firm? The mockery in his voice was instant and sharp. He turned it into a performance, making sure everyone at the table heard him. That's adorable, Lauren. Really. But let's be realistic here. He leaned back in his chair, addressing the group rather than me. Starting a consulting firm requires client relationships, industry credibility, and business acumen. No offense, but you're not exactly leadership material. People shifted uncomfortably, but nobody defended me. Colin continued, warming to his theme. I mean, you can barely manage your current workload without constant supervision. Imagine trying to run an entire business. You'd sink it in a week. The office became his stage, and I became his punchline. Others laughed nervously, afraid to be on his bad side. Someone changed the subject quickly, embarrassed by the cruelty. But the damage was done. Colin had publicly declared me incompetent, small, unworthy of ambition. And that moment changed everything. Something snapped inside me. Not out loud. Not in anger or dramatic confrontation. But quietly, cleanly, like a thread pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. I didn't defend myself in that moment. I didn't argue or try to prove him wrong. I didn't make a scene or storm out dramatically. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I'd missed before. He was small. His power came from tearing others down, not building anything himself. His confidence was borrowed from other people's work. His success was built on stolen achievements and political maneuvering, not actual skill. And in that moment of clarity, I thought with absolute certainty, you're small, Colin. You just don't know it yet. The anger I felt wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and precise. It was the kind of anger that builds plans instead of burning bridges. The kind that documents everything and waits for the right moment. I smiled politely, excused myself from the table, and went back to my desk. But inside, everything had shifted. I wasn't going to quit in a fury or file a complaint that would go nowhere. I was going to do something much more effective. I was going to prove him wrong. I sat in my car afterward, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding as I replayed his laugh over and over. The parking garage was quiet except for the hum of ventilation fans. I stared at the concrete wall in front of me, feeling the weight of 3 years of stolen credit, dismissive reviews, and public humiliation pressing down on my chest. Then I whispered to the steering wheel, my voice barely audible even to myself, fine. Let's see what happens when I actually try. That was the day the ground shifted beneath everything I thought I knew about my career, my worth, and what I was capable of accomplishing. I wasn't building a revenge fantasy. I was building an exit strategy. A real one. I drove home, made coffee, and opened my laptop. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't working on someone else's project. I was working on mine. The blank document stared back at me, cursor blinking patiently. I titled it Pierce Advisory Business Plan and began typing. Market analysis. Service offerings. Competitive advantages. Financial projections. I worked until 3 in the morning, fueled by coffee and something stronger than anger. Purpose. By dawn, I had 20 pages of notes. It wasn't polished or perfect, but it was real. It was mine. And Colin had no idea what he'd started. I spent every evening for the next 2 weeks refining my business plan. After finishing my regular work, I'd come home, eat something quick, and dive back into research. Licensing requirements for independent consultants in my state. Branding strategies that would differentiate me from larger firms. Service structures that offered clients better value than what they were getting from companies like Westfield. I studied business formation documents, tax implications, and insurance requirements. I mapped out my first 6 months of operations, including worst-case financial scenarios. I drafted client contracts that were fair and clear, unlike the confusing legal jargon Westfield buried people in. This wasn't revenge I was building. This was freedom. Freedom from supervisors who stole credit. Freedom from workplace politics that rewarded charm over competence. Freedom to finally be recognized for my actual contributions instead of watching someone else wear my achievements like borrowed clothes. Some nights I doubted myself. Colin's mocking laughter would echo in my head, and I'd wonder if he was right. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe I didn't have what it took. But then I'd remember all the clients who specifically requested to work with me. The problems I'd solved that Colin couldn't. The presentations I'd perfected while he took the applause. And I'd keep working, page by page, building my escape route. One of my longtime clients, Patricia Huang, messaged me privately through LinkedIn one afternoon. "Lauren, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I have to ask. Are you okay?" I stared at the message, surprised. Patricia ran a mid-sized manufacturing company that I'd been consulting for over 2 years. We had a good working relationship, professional but warm. "I'm fine," I typed back carefully. "Why do you ask?" Her response made my heart skip. "Things feel off since Colin started managing our account directly. Responses are slower, less detailed. The strategic insights we used to get have disappeared. I don't want to cause problems, but honestly, we were working with you, not him." I sat back in my chair, mind racing. I couldn't discuss internal company politics with a client. That would be unprofessional and could get me fired. But Patricia's message confirmed what I'd suspected. Clients noticed the difference when Colin took over their accounts. They knew who had actually been doing the work. "I can't discuss internal team structures," I wrote carefully. "But I appreciate you reaching out. I'll make sure your account gets the attention it deserves." Her final message was brief: "If you ever go independent, call me first." That message lit a fire I didn't know I had. It wasn't just my imagination. The clients knew. They saw through Colin's act. And they wanted the real consultant, not the credit thief. That night, I added Patricia's company to my potential client list and kept building. Colin started micromanaging me with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He corrected trivial things that didn't matter, like font choices in internal memos or the exact wording of email subject lines. He called my ideas overly ambitious during team meetings, even when those same ideas had worked successfully for other clients. He accused me of being unfocused and distracted, despite the fact that my project completion rate was the highest on our team. I realized what was happening. He sensed something shifting. Maybe it was my attitude, which had gone from eager to coolly professional. Maybe it was the way I'd stopped volunteering for his personal projects. Maybe it was the fact that I'd started documenting everything in writing, creating paper trails for every decision and every stolen idea. Whatever it was, Colin felt me slipping out from under his thumb, and it terrified him. Because without someone competent to steal from, he'd have to actually do his job. The micromanaging got worse. He scheduled daily check-ins that served no purpose except to waste my time. He questioned every client interaction I had, demanding detailed reports of phone calls and emails. He even tried to limit my direct contact with clients, insisting all communication go through him first. It was almost funny. He was tightening his grip precisely when it no longer mattered. Because I wasn't planning to stay much longer. I handed in my resignation on a Tuesday morning, 2 months after Colin's public humiliation. I'd timed it carefully. I'd secured my business license, set up my LLC, and had 3 potential clients lined up before I said a word. I walked into Colin's office with a printed resignation letter and placed it on his desk. He looked up, confused, then read the first line. His eyes widened. "You're quitting? For what?" His voice was higher than usual, almost panicked. I smiled calmly, professionally. "I'm starting my own consulting firm. Something I've been building." The blood drained from his face as he connected the dots. "You can't be serious. Lauren, this is a terrible decision. You don't have the experience, the connections, the ability." I finished for him. "Isn't that what you said? That I'd sink it in a week?" Colin stood up, trying to regain his authority. "Look, if this is about your review, we can discuss adjustments." I may have been harsh, but it's not about the review, I interrupted, keeping my voice even. It's about building something that values actual work, not office politics. He scoffed, but there was fear behind it now. Fear that he was losing his best resource. Fear that he'd pushed too far and created competition. "You'll be back," he said, forcing confidence into his voice. Running a business is harder than you think. When this fails, don't expect to walk back in here. I picked up my box of personal items and headed for the door. I won't be back, Colin. Good luck with your accounts. I left him standing there, and I never looked back. I officially launched Pierce Advisory out of my one-bedroom apartment. My office was a small desk I'd bought secondhand from a thrift store, positioned by the window where the light was best. My equipment consisted of a laptop that was 4 years old and still worked perfectly, and a cheap printer that shook the whole table whenever it ran. My filing system was a plastic crate from a hardware store. My business cards were printed at an office supply store for $20. It wasn't glamorous. There was no receptionist, no conference room, no coffee machine in a break room. There was just me, working from dawn until midnight, building something real. But it was mine. Every inch of it. Every decision, every client interaction, every success and every mistake belonged to me alone. Nobody would steal credit for my work. Nobody would dismiss my ideas in meetings. Nobody would rate me as adequate while using my achievements to build their career. The first few days were terrifying. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, panicked, wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. What if Colin was right? What if I couldn't do this? But then morning would come, and I'd sit at my second-hand desk, open my laptop, and get back to work. Because even fear couldn't stop me now. I'd already jumped, and there was no going back. My first client signed on during my second week in business. It was Marcus Webb, a vendor I'd worked with during my time at Westfield. He ran a small supply chain consulting practice and had always been impressed with my analytical approach. "I heard you went independent," he said during our phone call. "I've got a project that would be perfect for you, if you're interested." My hands trembled as I sent him the contract. This was it. My first real client. My first proof that I could do this. When he signed and returned it an hour later, I burst into tears. Happy tears, scared tears, hopeful tears, all mixed together. I sat at my desk, crying like I hadn't cried in years, feeling the weight of uncertainty lift just slightly. One client. One contract. One step forward. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It meant I wasn't crazy for trying. It meant someone believed in me enough to pay for my services. It meant Colin had been wrong. That evening, I treated myself to takeout from my favorite restaurant and ate it at my desk while working on Marcus's project. It was the best meal I'd had in months. Not because the food was different, but because I was eating it as my own boss, working on my own client's project, building my own future. The next morning, I woke up excited to work for the first time in 3 years. That feeling was worth more than any salary. The firm Colin and I used to work for lost a major client. I heard about it through the professional grapevine, from a former colleague who kept in touch. "Things are tense at Westfield," she told me over coffee. The Riverside manufacturing account pulled out. Said they weren't satisfied with the service quality. I asked careful questions. Riverside had been one of my accounts before Colin took it over when I left. They were methodical, detail-oriented, and valued clear communication above all else. Apparently, my former colleague continued, they complained about slow response times and lack of strategic depth in reports. Colin's been managing that account personally. She didn't need to say more. I knew exactly what had happened. Colin couldn't deliver the same level of service I had provided because he'd never actually been doing the work. He'd been taking credit for it. Without me to steal from, his limitations became obvious. "Leadership is not pleased," she added. "There's talk of performance reviews for senior consultants." I felt a small, quiet satisfaction. Not joy at someone else's failure, but vindication. Proof that my work had mattered, that the quality difference was real, that I hadn't been imagining my own competence. Colin was finally being judged on his actual abilities, not his charm and stolen achievements. And he was failing. Publicly. Measurably. I thanked my colleague for the update and went back to work on my growing client list, smiling slightly. A second client reached out to me 3 weeks after I launched. Then a third client the following week. All referrals. No poaching, no cold outreach, No aggressive marketing. Just people tired of mediocre service and drawn to my reputation for reliability and thoroughness. The second client was a contact from Patricia Huang, the manufacturing executive who'd messaged me on LinkedIn. Patricia says you're the person I need to talk to, the new client explained during our initial call. She's raved about your work for years. The third was a former Westfield client whose contract had ended. They didn't renew with Westfield. Instead, they found me. We were told you'd left, she said. It took some digging to track you down, but we prefer working with you directly. The service was always better when you were personally involved. Each new client felt like validation. Each contract proved that Colin's assessment of me had been wrong. I wasn't adequate. I wasn't incompetent. I wasn't someone who needed constant supervision. I was exactly what these clients had been looking for all along, a consultant who listened, analyzed thoroughly, communicated clearly, and delivered results. By week 5, I had more work than I could handle alone. I started researching how to hire my first employee. Pearce Advisory was no longer just an idea or a hope. It was a functioning business with real clients and real revenue. And it was growing. Rumor had it Colin erupted during a team meeting. The story came through multiple sources, each adding their own details, but the core facts remained consistent. He'd been presenting quarterly numbers to senior management when someone pointed out his department's declining client retention rate. Colin had thrown a folder across the table, pages scattering everywhere. Everyone's useless, he'd shouted, according to witnesses. I can't do everything myself. You people need to step up. He'd blamed his team for poor performance, blamed clients for being difficult, blamed market conditions for making consulting harder. He'd blamed everyone except himself. The meeting had ended in uncomfortable silence, with senior management exchanging concerned looks. Then someone, probably a junior associate who hadn't yet learned to stay quiet, had said in a voice just loud enough to hear, maybe Lauren had the right idea, leaving when she did. Colin had stormed out of the room, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the walls. That comment, that single observation, had apparently struck a nerve deeper than anything else. Because it suggested what Colin feared most, that my departure hadn't been a failure of nerve or ability, but a smart decision to escape his toxic management. The story spread through professional networks within hours. People were talking. And not about me being a failure. About Colin being exposed. By week 6, my business had grown enough to rent a tiny office space. It was barely more than a closet with a window, located in a shared business complex where startup founders and freelancers worked side by side. The walls were bare. The overhead light flickered occasionally. The blinds hung crooked, and the carpet had stains from previous tenants. But it smelled like possibility. Like freedom. Like the future I was building with my own hands. Clients loved my transparent approach. Unlike larger firms that buried fees in complex contracts and surprise charges, I operated with complete honesty. My pricing was clear. My processes were straightforward. My communication was frequent and detailed. I treated clients like partners, not revenue sources. One client told me during a project wrap-up call, "Working with you is refreshing. We actually understand what we're paying for and why." That kind of feedback meant everything. It proved that good service wasn't complicated. It just required respect, competence, and honesty. Meanwhile, through the professional grapevine, I heard that Colin was drowning. Projects were missing deadlines. Clients were complaining about communication gaps. His team morale had collapsed completely, with 2 people quietly transferring to other departments. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. I was building something sustainable. Colin was barely keeping his head above water. And senior management at Westfield was starting to notice the difference. Senior management visited Colin's department unannounced one afternoon. It was the corporate equivalent of a home inspection when the seller suspects problems. According to my sources, 2 executives showed up without warning, asking to review recent project files and client communications. They conducted what they called a routine operational audit, but everyone knew what it really meant. Colin was under investigation. They reviewed his project completion rates, compared them to historical performance when I'd been on his team, and asked pointed questions about declining client satisfaction scores. They interviewed team members privately, asking about management style and work distribution. They examined financial reports, looking for discrepancies or inefficiencies. The audit lasted 2 full days. Colin tried to maintain his usual confident demeanor, but people who saw him during that time said he looked pale, anxious, constantly checking his phone like he was waiting for bad news. No one spoke publicly about the audit's findings. Corporate environments rarely air their dirty laundry. But whispers spread through the office. This doesn't look good for him. I heard they found major problems. Someone said client complaints have tripled since Lauren left. The writing was on the wall. Colin had built his reputation on borrowed competence. Now that the real source was gone, his own limitations were becoming impossible to hide. And management was finally paying attention to what had been obvious to everyone else for years. A massive corporate client reached out to Pearce Advisory 2 months after I launched. "We heard about your work through professional channels," the CEO said during our initial call. "We're looking for a consulting partner who can provide detailed market analysis for an expansion project. Would you be interested in discussing this?" Would I be interested? This was the kind of project that could sustain my business for 6 months. The contract value alone exceeded everything I'd earned so far combined. But when they sent over background materials and I saw their company name, I almost dropped my phone. It was Carrington Industries, one of Colin's flagship accounts at Westfield, one of the biggest, most prestigious clients in his portfolio. And they were reaching out to me. I spent 3 days preparing for the pitch meeting, crafting a proposal that showcased everything I knew about their industry, their competitors, and their strategic challenges. When I presented, the room went quiet. Not the uncomfortable silence of people waiting for you to finish. The focused silence of people genuinely interested in what you're saying. "This is exactly what we needed," the CEO said afterward. "Clear, strategic, actionable. When can you start?" They chose me. They left Colin and Westfield entirely. They signed a 6-month contract with 2-year potential. I sat in my car after that meeting, hands shaking, barely able to process what had just happened. 2 months ago, Colin had laughed at the idea of me running my own firm. Now I'd just secured his most important client. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Colin was demoted. Quietly, but unmistakably. Word spread through professional networks within days of Carrington Industries pulling their contract. Westfield's leadership had apparently reached their limit. The audit findings, combined with the loss of their second-largest client, had forced them to act. Colin was stripped of his senior consultant title and moved to an associate role. His team was dissolved and redistributed among other supervisors. His corner office was reassigned. His responsibilities were reduced to individual project work with no management authority. He walked around the office like a ghost wearing a suit, according to people who still worked there. His swagger was gone. His confident smirk had disappeared. He looked smaller, older, defeated. Some colleagues felt sorry for him. Most didn't. Years of stolen credit, public humiliation of subordinates, and toxic management had built up resentment that now had permission to surface. People who'd been afraid to speak up before suddenly felt comfortable sharing their stories. HR received multiple complaints about past behavior now that Colin no longer had power over anyone's career. The fall was as dramatic as his rise had been. And I felt nothing but a quiet sense of justice. Not joy at his suffering, but satisfaction that competence finally mattered more than charm. That hard work was finally being recognized instead of stolen. That the system, however slowly, had eventually corrected itself. Colin had destroyed his own career through arrogance and incompetence. I had simply stopped propping him up. 2 months after he laughed in my face, I received a job application to Pearce Advisory. The email came through my business account with an attached resume. Sender, Colin Foster. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. He'd applied to work for me. For my firm. The company I'd built from nothing while he'd mocked me for even trying. His cover letter was formal, professional, highlighting his extensive consulting experience and proven track record of client management. He mentioned Westfield by name, clearly expecting the association to impress me. But here's what made it surreal: he didn't recognize the company name. Pierce Advisory was young enough that it hadn't made a significant mark on industry directories yet. Colin had applied blindly, probably mass-sending resumes to any consulting firm that might hire him. He didn't know I owned it. Didn't know the person reviewing his application was the same employee he'd humiliated, exploited, and dismissed. He'd applied as if I owed him a lifeline. As if his years of experience entitled him to opportunity, regardless of his behavior or reputation. I read through his resume carefully. Every major achievement listed was something I'd actually done. The Riverside manufacturing project success. The market analysis that won 3 new clients. The strategic framework that increased efficiency by 30%. All mine. All stolen. All presented as his own accomplishments, even now. I saved the application to a folder, then sat back in my chair, considering my options. I could interview him just to see his face when he realized. I could send a detailed rejection explaining exactly why he was unqualified. But neither option felt right. I didn't call. I didn't message. I didn't write a long explanation or try to teach him a lesson. I simply declined his application with a professional, 3-word response through the automated system: not a fit. No additional comments. No feedback. Just the same cold, dismissive rejection that companies send to thousands of applicants every day. The kind of rejection that tells you nothing except that you weren't chosen. The kind Colin had probably received dozens of times by now, from firms who'd heard about his reputation. As I closed my laptop, afternoon sunlight hit the walls of my new office. The space was bigger now, with room for 2 employees I'd hired last month. Client files organized in proper cabinets. A conference table for meetings. A coffee maker that actually worked. My business license framed on the wall. Everything I'd built in 10 weeks, starting from nothing but determination and competence Colin claimed I didn't have. He'd destroyed his own career through arrogance, stolen credit, and toxic management. I hadn't sabotaged him or spread rumors. I'd simply stopped enabling his incompetence by removing myself from his reach. And that absence had been enough to expose what had always been true: without someone talented to exploit, Colin had nothing to offer. I stood up, stretched, and checked my calendar. 3 client meetings tomorrow. A pitch presentation on Friday. Contract negotiations next week. The business was thriving, growing, becoming exactly what I'd imagined during those late nights of planning. The best revenge, I realized, was never about hurting him. It was about outgrowing him entirely. About building something real while he collapsed under the weight of his own mediocrity. About proving that competence, honesty, and hard work eventually win, even when the game feels rigged. Colin had laughed when I said I'd start my own firm. 2 months later, he was unemployed and desperate enough to apply to the very company he'd mocked. That wasn't revenge. That was just gravity, pulling things back to where they belonged. I picked up my phone and called my next client. There was work to do, and for the first time in my career, all the credit would go exactly where it belonged. To me.